I'm Dr. Sue Onslow. I'm Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. And it's my great pleasure to chair this discussion, not all by ourselves, South Africa's transition to democracy in 1994. This is an online webinar. We are recording this, so it will be turned into a podcast after the end of the discussion. And we're also inviting people to type their questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. So there won't be live questions from the audience, but I will be introducing the questions from the audience and moderating them. It gives me great pleasure to welcome 4 expert speakers to this panel. My colleague here at the Institute, Dr. Stuart Mole, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Stuart is a former Commonwealth diplomat. He was special assistant to the Secretary General 1984 to 1990 during the time of Secretary General Sami Ramphal. And then he was director of the Secretary General's office, of course, Chief Emeka Anyoko in the 1990s. I know, Stuart, your Commonwealth career went on longer than that, but this is appropriate for our discussion today. Stuart is currently working on his manuscript for his PhD on the Commonwealth apartheid and South Africa's transition to democracy, to be published by Routledge later this year. I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Tula Simpson at the University of Pretoria, who of course is the author of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the ANC's Armed Struggle, and also A History of South Africa from 1902. So welcome, Tula, from Pretoria. Then to welcome Professor Emily Bridger at University of Exeter, whose first book, Young Women Against Apartheid, was published in 2021. And I know that you're working on your next book, Emily, so we look forward very much to that publication. And fourthly, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Peter du Toit. Peter is an investigative journalist and editor at News 24 in South Africa. He's written a number of books, the latest of which is the ANC's Billionaires, published in 2022. Stuart will be speaking first, followed by Tula, Emily, and then Peter, and then we'll be widening it to discussion. So thank you very much indeed, colleagues. If I could invite you to turn off your microphones, please, so that there isn't any background noise on the recording, I'd be very grateful. Stuart, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sue. There is a public perception that F.W. de Klerk's historic 1990 speech signifying white South Africa's disavowal of apartheid and the specific steps that he took to make good that pledge, including unbanning political parties, allowing free political activity, and of course, releasing Nelson Mandela from jail, made the end of apartheid inevitable. All that was needed was for the 2 charismatic Nobel Prize winners, Mandela and de Klerk, to guide South Africa to the 1994 elections and to its destiny as a non-racial and democratic state. Well, not quite. What is certainly true was that the character of the final assault on apartheid differed from much of what had gone on before. Previous decades had seen the crushing of internal dissent, the exiling of the regime's opponents, and military aggression beyond South Africa's borders. But as the citadel grew stronger, so its isolation steadily increased. The arms embargo, the sporting boycott, cultural isolation, military support for liberation groups, economic sanctions. This all represented collective pressure coming from the burgeoning global anti-apartheid movement, but also from governments, from international organizations, and from individual citizens around the world. This in turn spurred on a new generation of internal resistance. By contrast, the story of apartheid's final days, particularly 1990 to 1994, very largely belong to South Africans alone. Only their tenacity and dedication, capacity to reconcile difference, and endurance and patience finally led to a negotiated settlement and the electoral birth of the new Rainbow Nation. And yet, even at this point, and as the shadow of violence sometimes seemed overwhelming, the international campaign found important ways of supporting the transition. And this is the focus of my brief remarks. The negotiated transition was to be built on the principle of inclusivity, that as many of the parties as possible should be included in the negotiating framework, and that even if there was not complete unanimity, sufficient consensus, as it was called, might be able to keep the process moving forward. In that respect, the relationship between the two principal protagonists, the National Party and the African National Congress, and some measure of trust between them was essential. Other parties, both on the right and the left, might boycott talks periodically, but it would only be in the final stages that the absence of key parties might prove critical. Violence was already a constant underlaying. The apartheid state was seen by many as inherently violent in enforcing its racial and repressive laws, in the paramilitary style of its policing, and in the emergency measures it took to control the townships. Then there was third force covert action and military raids and conflict across South Africa's borders. In the townships themselves, a low-level civil war had been underway since the 1980s. Alongside rent strikes and boycotts, liberation groups responded militarily to threats, whether external or internal. After 1990, the violence intensified, not black on black violence as it was sometimes solely characterized, but a far more complex mix, in part, in the view of Adrian Gelker, as a function of political competition. In the period, 16,000 people died, around 6,000 were injured, and tens of thousands were displaced or driven from their homes. More deaths in those 3.5 years than in the whole of the rest of the apartheid era. Apart from political violence, some have spoken of a culture of violence in society, surge in homicide, domestic abuse, and around 300,000 rapes each year. At times, the spike in violence, say the 1992 Boipatong massacre, the murder of Chris Hani, the Communist Party leader and rising ANC star, attacks by the white right, or intercommunal violence in KwaZulu-Natal. These at times threatened the whole negotiation process. In 1986, the Commonwealth was involved in a major initiative to help kickstart the negotiation process, built around the mission of the Eminent Persons Group, which met all the key parties many times, including an imprisoned Mandela. When that failed, the Commonwealth decided to intensify economic and financial sanctions, leading to a parting of the ways with Mrs. Thatcher and the UK government. Commonwealth's much vaunted capacity for consensus making broke down, at least on this issue, leading some to characterize those 4 years that followed as the binary Commonwealth. Come 1991, Thatcher had been replaced by the more emollient John Major, sanctions had begun to be lifted, and the Commonwealth started to put its own house in order in requiring its members to uphold democratic and human rights principles. It also had a new Secretary General, Chief Emeka Anyoko, who had been with the EPG mission and was widely known and respected in South Africa. Even so, when Anyoko led his small team to South Africa after the 1991 Commonwealth Summit in Harare, his offer of help was met with a degree of skepticism. "What has changed?" asked de Klerk. "Not me," responded Anyoko, "but it is your desire to abolish apartheid that now puts us on the same side." Of several proposals put forward by Anyoko, it was the idea of international observers that they might be present and observe the opening plenary of multi-party talks, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, that gradually took hold. 2 months later, those international observers duly did start, around 1,000 of them that did attend the opening of those negotiations. This was a symbolic contribution rather than anything else, signifying a watching world, but it did lead Anyoko to believe that international observers could play a sustained role in addressing the rising levels of violence. The early signs were not good. De Klerk was openly hostile, telling Desmond Tutu that it would be a gross infringement of South African sovereignty and grave challenge to the legitimacy of his government. The ANC were reluctant, Mandela unconvinced, and the UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali had considerable reservations. However, the Boipatong massacre of June 1992, in which 45 township residents were killed by IFP assailants, led to the complete breakdown of the now ailing CODESA process. With the ANC initiating a rolling mass action and fears of greater violence, Cyrus Vance was appointed the UN Special Representative, and in August, the Security Council approved Resolution 772. This gave a mandate to 4 international organizations, the UN, the Commonwealth, the European Community, as it was, and the OAU, the African Union now, to deploy international observers under the structures set up under the National Peace Accord. Spurred on by the Bisho massacre in September, in which 29 died, the 4 teams began to arrive. My allotted time is beginning to slip away, but to summarize, the Commonwealth Observer Mission to South Africa had 3 phases of deployment. But unlike the UN and the European Community, it was always concentrated in 2 violent hotspots, KwaZulu-Natal and the townships of the East Rand. These were specialist teams with a range of expertise in areas such as policing, criminology, the law, judiciary, conflict resolution, etc. They were headed by figures of stature, able to engage at a high diplomatic level. Justice Austin Amisar, the former Attorney General of Ghana, headed COMSA 1. Professor Duncan Chappell, the Australian criminologist, led COMSA 2. Under the coordination of the UN mission, observers entered hotspots, sought to calm and separate opposing parties, attended rallies, marches, and potentially explosive gatherings. In KwaZulu-Natal, led by the remarkable Moses Anafu, the Commonwealth team helped set up local dispute resolution committees and mediated between the parties in some of the major unrest areas. But they also, the whole team also engaged at a high policy level on issues such as policing and the administration of justice. Once the election date was fixed, the composition of COMSA 3 was much more oriented to electoral preparations and technical assistance, eventually morphing into the much larger Commonwealth Election Observer Group, the largest the Commonwealth has ever deployed for the 1994 elections. In the latter stages, a mixed military police Commonwealth peacekeeping group was hastily assembled to train a South African national peacekeeping force for the elections, but this partially prepared force was not able to make a significant or even perhaps a positive contribution in the time available. So in conclusion, it is undeniable that South African courage and leadership was crucial at moments of extreme crisis. Mandela, after the murder of Chris Hani, Chief Buthelezi in bringing Inkatha into the electoral process and the logistical nightmare that entailed, General Constant Viljoen in his decision to also take part in elections by leading the Freedom Front and abandoning white military resistance. But international observers helped lower the temperature and decrease violence and prepare the way for the uncontroversial deployment of an unprecedented amount of international election observers, alongside many thousands of domestic observers at the 94 elections. These observers were also a constant presence on the ground throughout the 3 years, the eyes and ears which could brief governments and international organizations, and in the case of the Commonwealth and the UN, invoked the Good Office's intervention of the Secretary General. The 1994 elections were chaotic and sometimes clearly fraudulent, but they were also a joyous festival of freedom. Inclusivity triumphed, and Judge Kriegler, the chair of the Independent Electoral Commission, said that not a single life was lost to electoral violence during polling. It was not a miracle, but the extraordinary culmination of countless acts of wisdom and dedication, which made the birth of the new nation possible. In that, the international community played its part so that a negotiated settlement could be followed by, at least in part, a negotiated election. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stuart, for summarizing so briskly your 100,000 word PhD and emphasizing the Commonwealth's contribution, as you say, to international observers and the ways in which it sought to influence the course of those fraught negotiations. Tula, if I could invite you, please, to make your presentation.
Thank you. I've been asked to speak who drove change inside South Africa with a particular prompt: Black leaders, unions, and civic groups. Now, in discussing South Africa's late 20th century transition, I'll begin by considering what rather than who drove change. In other words, I feel it must be rooted in changes in the structure of South African society. In the 19th and early 20th century, low-cost labor facilitated the introduction of Southern Africa's mineral and agricultural products onto the world market. By the mid-20th century, the economy's diversification into manufacturing entailed adjustments in social arrangements that were central points of controversy in the 1948 apartheid election that brought D.F. Malan's National Party to power. Now, in defeat, the outgoing Prime Minister Jan Smuts offered criticisms of apartheid as it was being proposed by the Nats, that the National Party was never able to satisfactorily answer. He raised the issue of the need of a permanent urban African population, did Smuts, to meet the labor needs of the economy. By contrast, apartheid's attempts to achieve racial segregation along pre-industrial settlement patterns had the function of creating a push and pull relationship, the push created by the fact that there was not enough land to support the African majority, and the pull created by the continuing demand of white employers for African labor. It's in this macro level context that the agency of Black leaders, unions, and civil groups inside South Africa, I believe, must best be understood. For Black anti-apartheid leaders, the banning of the South African Communist Party in 1950, the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1960, and the Black Consciousness Movement in 1977 provided a context in which underground activity was always a necessity that one had to provide for. And its hazards meant that many shared Nelson Mandela and Robert Sobukwe's experience of imprisonment, or even worse, Steve Biko's fate in 1977. These restrictions heightened the importance of the international dimension in the South African struggle. Foreign support opened the possibility of organizing beyond the reach of the apartheid state, and the external movements were therefore able to both mobilize the international community and catalyze internal resistance in important ways. When assessing the impact of ANC strategies, some tend to juxtapose the effectiveness of its external maneuver with the impotence of its efforts to mobilize internal resistance, but this is arguably a misreading. For example, violence was a prerequisite for diplomatic recognition by Organization of African Unity States, and the United Nations made diplomatic recognition by African states a prerequisite for recognition of movements. In short, without armed struggle, the mobilization of the international community would not have been possible. Therefore, there's no way of disentangling these two aspects of the struggle. The history of the Southwest African National Union should be on everybody's mind as an example in this context of the kind of damage that a liberation movement is vulnerable to in the context of the external mission of the 1960s onwards. But violence also had a direct importance and influence on internal developments. Targeted violence enabled the destabilization of opponents within the country, both preserving ANC hegemony within the African opposition, while also defeating government efforts at developing a third force. And it also enabled the ANC to dovetail effectively with mass resistance within the country. These are all important reasons as to why the ANC was able to capitalize and become the leading beneficiary of the ferment in South Africa. As far as the unions are concerned, the changes in the structure of the economy that I referred to are important. The very success of the color bar in the embourgeoisement of the white working class made it increasingly uneconomic to employ white workers in a growing number of working class occupations. The growing dependency of the economy on increasingly skilled African workers gave Black unions important leverage when they decided to broach the issue of political unionism, i.e. linking workplace and political issues in the 1980s. Civic groups' impact was less important than a form of resistance within civil society that became important, again, as a result of the structural changes that I refer to. The non-violent tradition in the anti-apartheid movement always rested on Black South Africans trying to make apartheid workable by using the force of numbers against the regime. Whether in the ANC Alliance's Defiance campaign of 1952 or the PAC's anti-pass campaign of 1960, the idea was that mass non-cooperation would make discriminatory legislation unenforceable. The state, as with the politicians, responded with mass arrests, which paralyzed overt political resistance. But the structural developments outlined previously facilitated a form of depoliticized disobedience that was highly effective and ultimately, I would argue, decisive. Specifically, sustained mass migration from the homelands to the urban areas in contravention of apartheid policy was, again, met with mass arrests, i.e. the history of the past laws. But the process was on such a scale, and that push-pull relationship that I referred to earlier had such a self-generating mechanism that it ultimately overwhelmed the state's capacities. And the presence of a permanent urban African population from the 70s onwards, which people knew could not be reversed, impressed on everybody the sense of the unworkability of the strategy. So the master plan of the liberation movement succeeded, although not necessarily in the way that they initially conceived it. As the 1980s developed, unworkability was augmented by ungovernability. And what I mean here is that the apartheid ideology involved the state consciously refusing to prepare and plan for mass urbanization. In other words, the 1948 election saw Smuts talking about housing, education, even political representation, albeit on a segregated basis, for Africans whose labor was needed in the cities. Apartheid basically involves demagoguing this issue and neglecting to make the necessary provisions. For many years, the resulting socioeconomic backlogs were a problem for Africans, but from June 1976 onwards, they became an existential problem for the regime in fueling wave after wave of mass insurrection and revolt. The state sought to make up for lost time, but it was unable to do so. Mass political violence during the 1980s caused local apartheid structures to collapse, rendering the townships ungovernable from the mid-1980s onwards, except by means of a state of emergency, which had to be renewed annually. Every time the government consulted its security experts, they were told that restrictions could not be lifted because of a prevailing quote-unquote revolutionary climate. And what that meant was an understanding by the security analysts that if the lid was lifted, there would be an explosion of violence, as happened when the restrictions were briefly suspended for a 3-month period in 1986. This is important because emergency rule is direct rule. It is introduced when indirect rule through local councillors collapses. What we see there is the collapse of the system of indirect segregationist rule. It again psychologically conditions South Africans to the idea and the understanding of a unitary future. Psychological preconditions are key for the so-called miracle transformation. Emergency rule gave greater weight to the security services. The advice they gave the government, as former South African Defence Force Chief Constant Viljoen stated, was that in Africa from Mau Mau onwards, there's a situation where in the face of nationalist revolt, a political stalemate such as South Africa was experiencing had repeatedly emerged, whereby the British, French, Portuguese and Rhodesians were able in purely military terms to continue, but as their political position gradually eroded, the morale of the white civilian population plummeted to the point that when negotiations began, there was little more to discuss than the modalities of handing over the keys to power. With the state militarily strong and politically weak, and the opposite applying with the militarily strong and politically weak, and vice versa with the ANC, it was time to talk. Lastly, in terms of lasting legacies, the initial impetus provided by apartheid's end, the end of sanctions was a benefit. The end of attempts to make apartheid work removed many contradictions and pointless duplications. But those tailwinds would, in short order, be followed by headwinds, owing to the fact that apartheid's crisis was one that the ANC essentially inherited. Political change could only partly resolve it because the issues were only partly political. The economic contribution of the homelands to the economy was very weak, and it was inevitable that people would continue migrating from them, and the ANC would be left essentially with Smuts's problem, but having to face the accumulated apartheid backlog in dealing with them. Now, in coping, there were further challenges, namely that of all these Southern African liberation movements, MPLA, Frelimo, ZANU, the ANC was the furthest from the seizure of power in military terms when it came to 1994. In other words, it inherited old regime structures intact to an extent that no other liberation movement felt. This leads to a great sense of vulnerability within the ANC and an anxiety to consolidate power. And this involves using political control to try and control the ANC's grip on the levers of state power. Now, this upheaval would inevitably affect state capacity with consequences for the poor who are dependent on state resources. This would birth a whole new post-apartheid problematic. Lastly, what might be called anti-apartheid ideology has not always been helpful. Controversially, I would say it's been unhelpful in a number of ways. For example, as a result of the evolution of the economy, and not least the successful labor movement struggles of the 70s and 80s, South Africa in the 1990s is no longer, in global terms, a low-wage economy. Mass migration to South Africa from the rest of the continent of people seeking better lives should have disabused people of any misperceptions to the contrary. The anti-apartheid understanding, as it came to be understood, is based on the idea and on interventions appropriate to South Africa as a low-wage economy. The legacy of apartheid in terms of its skills that it has left to the majority population leaves them poorly placed to compete in a high-wage, open, globalized economy, and that's the birth of a whole other wave of post-apartheid problematics. And thank you. I'll pass over to Sue at that point.
Thank you very much indeed, Thulo, and particularly for underlining your arguments about the key legacies, because as you've pointed to, this is the first of two discussions that we're organizing in the lead up to South Africa's election. And we want to have this discussion about the transition, about the processes of transition, precisely because these continue to feed into the challenges and confrontations facing South Africa and South Africans today. Emily, if I could invite you to make your remarks, please.
Sure, thanks, Sue. So before turning to the past, I want to open by briefly talking about a recent event. So over the course of the last year, members of an organization called the Khulumani Support Group have been staging protests at the front entrance of Johannesburg's Constitution Court. In April of last year, the group slept on the concrete steps of the court for 3 weeks. And again in October, with their demands still not met, the group again convened outside the Concourt, and this time their sleep out protest lasted for 10 weeks. Now, the Khulumani Support Group is a membership-based civil society organization which was founded in 1995 with the goal of aiding victims of apartheid-era human rights abuses wanting to testify before the country's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And today, Khulumani continues to push the government to pay further reparations to apartheid's victims, and is today one of the country's loudest critics of the TRC's flawed reparations process. Now, many of the Khulumani members involved in these latest protests were from the organization's East Rand branch, so from the townships of Thokoza and Katlehong, which experienced much of the brunt of the transition era violence that Stuart spoke about between 1990 and 1994. And many of these members who slept outside the Constitution Court for weeks are elderly women, many in their 70s and 80s, and many also with quite serious health problems or disabilities. And yet night after night, often in the rain and cold with very little to eat or drink, they slept on the concrete steps of the courthouse, pushing for reparations for the abuses they suffered during South Africa's transition era. So since 2019, I've been conducting life history interviews with the female members of Khulumani's East Rand branch in Thokoza. And with the help of my colleague Kafue McKenna at WITS, we've now interviewed about 55 of these women, all of whom lived in Thokoza or Katlehong during the 1990s conflict, and all of whom were deeply affected by it. Their homes were raided and looted. They were often forced to flee for their safety. Many were beaten or even shot. Most lost at least one close family member, be it their husband, child, or sibling, and some were also raped. And as their ongoing struggles through Kulimani demonstrate, for these women, the transition era is not confined to the past. So the question I want to ask in my remarks today is, what does the transition era look like if we center these women's narratives and experiences? What can their oral histories teach us about the period that is forgotten or left out of either global celebratory histories of the end of apartheid, or local and national histories focused on political allegiances and discords? So these women's accounts highlight the lingering long-term trauma and harm that has resulted from transition era violence and the tangled, complex aftermaths of this era. For these women, the violence and its impacts on their bodies, lives, and relationships did not end in 1994, but continues. The violence has caused lasting damage to their families, not just through the death of children or husbands, but also through intergenerational trauma, which many women explain to us has led many of their children and grandchildren today to turn to alcohol and drugs. Some never found out how their loved ones died during the war and have been unable to give them proper burial. Several women were physically injured during the violence and consequently had to stop working for the rest of their lives. Others, unable to travel to their workplaces during the war, were fired and never found other work. Some forced to flee their homes in the 1990s were never able to return and have lived in backyard shacks or dilapidated hostels ever since. Now, these tangled aftermaths were encompassed in one particular woman's narrative. And I won't go into any gratuitous detail here, but I will warn our audience that this story may be difficult to listen to. So in 1992, this woman, then living in the Thokoza squatter camp, Pola Park, was raped by a soldier from the notoriously brutal 32 Battalion of the South African Defence Force. In the aftermath, her husband blamed her for the abuse and stigmatized her for having slept with another man. He became abusive and their marriage broke down. But years later, they managed to reconcile and he came to understand what she'd been through. Then, on a trip to his rural home, he tried to intervene in another situation where a different woman was being raped, but he was stabbed and killed by the perpetrator. Today, the woman's son is an alcoholic and their relationship is strained because he blames her for his father's death, believing that his father would have never intervened in this second rape case if his own wife hadn't have been raped during the war. The woman is also HIV positive as a result of her rape during the transition era. So these long-term traumas and repercussions mean that for many women, there is no neat separation between the apartheid and post-apartheid periods. Many said things such as, quote, "We are never relieved of that pain, even today," or, quote, "We are still living under apartheid." I asked one woman, "How is your life since democracy?" And she responded, quote, "No, to me, democracy is just that, a word, because the life I am living is not what a human being is supposed to live." Now, because of these traumas and their aftermaths, these women have come to remember the transition era in particular ways. And their memories and their accounts of the war and the violence differ significantly from much of the historical scholarship on the period. So in recent historical work on transition era violence, much focus is placed on the various groups involved in the fighting and their complex relationships to one another. So we've heard today already about the ANC, the IFP, and the National Party. Then there's also, of course, hostel dwellers and self-defense units, the South African Defence Force, the police, the Internal Stability Unit, the 32 Battalion, etc. But the women that we spoke to admitted that during the violence, they had little understanding of who was perpetrating what, or what political, ethnic, or local divisions were fueling the war. For them, these years weren't about political divisions, but were about the human costs of violence and the emotional experiences of war. Now, that said, in the years since, these women and the wider organization of Kulimani that they belong to have formed a clearer narrative of the transition era, which very squarely attributes blame to the apartheid state. When asked about who was perpetrating violence, be it home invasions, killings, or sexual violence, women almost always said to us either, quote, the soldiers, or specifically the Afrikaners. Now, none mentioned violence perpetrated by self-defense unit members, and to my surprise, very few even talked about violence by IFP supporters or Zulu hostel dwellers. Instead, they attributed much of the violence to, quote, Afrikaners, who allegedly had their faces painted black to disguise themselves as Black men. Now, while never officially confirmed by documented cases, accounts of white soldiers or police disguised as Black men participating in transition era violence have circulated in the townships of Thokoza and Katlehong ever since 1990. And amongst Kulumani members, the belief that these men were the primary perpetrators of violence maintained strong currency. Excuse me. Kulumani's national organizer, Namarasha Banase, has herself talked about visiting a morgue during the war and seeing the bodies of white soldiers with their faces painted black. One woman we interviewed explained to us that it is a myth that Xhosas and Zulus were ever killing each other. It was actually Afrikaners, she said. When asked to explain how she knew this, she said, if you looked at the corpses, you would see both Xhosa and Zulu amongst the dead. Wouldn't that tell you something is fishy there? She asked us. Another woman we spoke to attributed sexual violence during the conflict to these same white men with black faces. And her explanation was, quote, South African men won't rape you. So we knew that it was the white Afrikaners that did that to us. Now, of course, we can't really know how factual such narratives are. And this is not to say that such incidents didn't happen, but instead to highlight the complex process of memory and meaning making that goes on in the wake of such violence, to help people comprehend the chaos and create coherent narratives of clear villains and victims. Telling these stories gives these women answers to unanswerable questions and makes the inexplicable explicable. It also, of course, aids in Kulumani's push for reparations by creating a clear narrative of not just the apartheid state's complicity in, but its direct responsibility for transition era violence. So to conclude, we're here today marking 30 years since the transition era. But for these women, no time seems to have passed. Many remain stuck in those years, still searching for answers about where the bodies of their husbands or sons are, why the violence happened, and why they and their families were at the center of it. And in this quest, they have forged their own historical narrative of the transition era, one that suits their needs of proving their victimhood to the state, one that helps them to find composure in the face of ongoing uncertainties and hardships, and one that I think further complicates our current understandings of this pivotal historical moment in South Africa. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Emily, and also for underlining, as you say, the lasting trauma and complicated aftermaths, particularly seen through that gendered lens, but exclusively so. So thank you very much indeed. Peter, may I invite you to make your presentation, please?
Thank you. Thanks, Sue. And taking cognizance of what my colleagues have said this afternoon in their submissions, I think it's fair to say that the theme of today's seminar, Not All by Ourselves, is 100% accurate, and that many forces were brought to bear which forced change in South Africa. Now, Capital too played a significant role before, during, and after the political transition, and dare I say, it needs to do so again, given our country's current predicaments. Now, the rise of a few well-connected and very wealthy billionaires and millionaires after 1994, almost all of them connected to the ANC and the liberation movement, is both testament to the opportunism of some individuals who very early on identified the rich seam of economic opportunity that freedom brought, and the belief by Capital that its alignment with the post-apartheid political elite could indeed be very profitable. Now, to take you back, in the late 1990s and the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Johannesburg Securities Exchange, or the Johannesburg Stock Exchange as it was known then, was controlled. 86% of stock on the JSE was controlled by only 5 or 6 companies. Anglo-American, Rembrandt, Sanlam, Old Mutual, Liberty Life, and Anglo-Val. And they had been producing rich profits for decades, and they had to find a way to survive with the new incoming elite. Now, I'm taking the story back to 1985, which was a banner year in South Africa, not for South Africa, but in South Africa, rather. It was the year that the state of emergency was declared, which was to last until 1990. It was the year in which the Trade Union Federation, COSATU, was established. The ANC's president in exile, Oliver Tambo, declared in his January 8th speech that the country would be made ungovernable that year. It was also the year in which P.W. Botha, the hardline National Party president, delivered his infamous Rubicon speech. And it was also the year in which foreign banks recalled South African loans, indeed, after Botha's speech. It was in this climate that organized business tried to tentatively intervene in the unfolding political process. And in September 1985, Gavin Reilly, educated at Diocesan College, or otherwise known as Bishops in Cape Town, and Oxford University, and a former special assistant to Harry Oppenheimer, led a delegation to a game reserve in the east of Zambia to meet the ANC. The ANC's delegation was led by Oliver Tambo. He was also joined by Thabo Mbeki, Mac Maharaj, Pallo Jordan, and others. And they discussed the state of the country, economic policy, and so on. But it was clear that there was a big divide by the South Africans at this meeting and the African National Congress. And incidentally, it didn't center around a future economic policy or the ANC's fixation at that stage with communism and socialism, but it centered around the armed struggle and who the aggressor was. Now, Anglo-Americans' attempt to intervene or to try and insert itself in the political process in 1985, of course, followed a couple of previous attempts before that. The Urban Foundation, established in 1976 in the wake of the Soweto uprisings by Harry Oppenheimer and Anton Rupert, as well as a later attempt by former judge Jan Steyn to try and cobble together something akin to a Bill of Rights to which he wanted business to adhere, were but some of the attempts and efforts by capital and big business to play a meaningful or a seemingly meaningful political role. All of those attempts had failed. Business and capital previously had contact with the Botha government at formal gatherings, such as those held in Cape Town, at the Good Hope Centre in Johannesburg, at the Carlton Hotel, but they were nothing but shows of force by the Botha government, who browbeat captains of industry into submission, and that happened repeatedly. Oppenheimer and Rupert, as the foremost exponents of capital during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, tried in their own individual ways to try and influence the apartheid leaders of the day. Rupert, for example, repeatedly attempted to try and convince first Hendrik Verwoerd, who was apartheid prime minister between 1958 and 1966, later on John Vorster, and after him P.W. Botha, to change course. That was rebuffed repeatedly. And Harry Oppenheimer, as we know, was a member of parliament for the opposition for the district of Kimberley, or the voting district of Kimberley, for a number of years. But for 37 years, business remained in a position where it was dependent on African labor for the creation of profit, and it was dependent on the apartheid government to maintain a system in which it, as capital, could flourish. And between 1948, when the National Party government acceded to power, and 1994 or 1985 rather, it did just that, and it remained rather close to the apartheid government on the establishment of the migrant labor system to help initially the mines. And here I'd like to reference Professor Charles van Onselen's fantastic work, The Night Trains, about the establishment of the migrant labor system on which mining and big business and industry relied so heavily. So why did big business, in the form of Anglo-American, have a change of heart in 1985? It was increasingly difficult to maintain profit margins for those companies. Labor forces became increasingly unstable, and those conglomerates, those companies, had nowhere to expand to. All the big conglomerates in South Africa had interests in everything from mining to department stores and record labels, and it was absolutely untenable for them to remain in that position. But I also argue that there emerged a new type of corporate leader in the mid-1985s, who, in my estimation, thought beyond profit and loss and rands and cents, and believed that political change was necessary, that it had to come, and that capital had a significant role to play. These individuals included someone like Michael Spicer, who was appointed Special Assistant to Gavin Reilly in 1985, and his first assignment when he was appointed into the Executive Chairman's office at Anglo American was to attend the Rubicon speech in the Durban City Hall. And he told me, and I quote him, "I sat literally within spitting distance from Botha, with emphasis on spitting at that stage." Between 1985 and 1990, we saw the emergence of the Consultative Business Forum, also supported by the leaders of the biggest companies on the JSE, to help facilitate contact between business at all levels and leaders of the liberation movement. Now, business leaders at that stage had a better idea of what was happening on the ground, on grassroots level, than many political leaders of the time had, because they worked on the proverbial shop floor with Black South Africans, and they could sense the rumblings of discontent earlier than many in the political elite could. The aforementioned Consultative Business Forum helped facilitate various meetings during that period in 1985 to 1990, even between 1990 and 1994. It was also responsible for the first multi-party agreement, which was the national peace process that was conducted and finalized at Barlow Rand's headquarters in Sandton, with a process designed by Bobby Godsell from Anglo American during the 1987 miners' strike. So it was thanks to businesses' facilitative role that the first multi-party agreement in the form of the national peace process could be finalized. Further on, the constitutional negotiations was also facilitated by many of the consultative business movement role players, who proceeded to provide support, logistical and other services to CODESA and the multi-party negotiating forum. But why? As with everything in South Africa, the answers are complex. Of course, there was a lot of self-interest. If capital wanted to remain active in the country, and if it wanted to maintain the enormous super profits that it had been able to secure for itself and its shareholders over the course of close to a century, it had to ensure that A, it knew who the prospective members of the new elite were, and B, it needed to try and influence the process of political change. That it did through events such as the Anglo-American ANC meeting in 1985, the emergence and the role of the consultative business movement, and subsequent engagements between big capital and the incoming political elite ahead of the 1994 election. Michael Spicer and others, who were part of the capital establishment back then, relayed to me how they spent thousands of hours debating with and talking to liberation leaders, certainly not only the ANC, but also COSATU, the PAC, the SACP, and others, about the economy, the changing geopolitical environment, and economic realities. The ANC did not have a grip on this, Michael Spicer told me, and capital, in the form of Anglo, felt it had to help bring them up to speed with modern economic thinking. Trevor Manuel, Minister of Finance, ANC Minister of Finance between 1996 and 2009, when he was removed by the burgeoning state capture project, said that the ANC was not prepared to direct any economic debate because the movement, and I quote, did not come from Lusaka with filing cabinets full of policy documents. Jay Naidu, who was General Secretary of COSATU between 1985 and 1994, relayed the trade union movement's immense frustration with the ANC to me, and I quote, they were not prepared to engage us in debate, despite us putting proposals on the table. The feeling was the ANC will decide on a future economic dispensation once it is in government. Now, the role of capital before the transition largely was to exercise influence in order to maintain as much of the status quo as possible, and post the transition to safeguard those victories by giving the new political elite access to capital and to the economy. Spicer, who I believe was someone who understood and championed the moral need for political change in South Africa, was open about what capital sought to achieve. They needed to show liberation leaders how a modern economy worked, how businesses are built, and how to take big decisions. And they did it, Sue, by selecting winners like Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, who today is one of the wealthiest people in the country, not because of his business acumen, or because he was able to rescue a struggling Anglo subsidiary, or because he invented a new mining process. It's because he was a senior ANC functionary, and Anglo, by giving him and his colleagues a chunk of landlord Barney Barnato's Johannesburg Consolidated Investments Company was good politics. Capital in South Africa has always largely been in lockstep with the government of the day. Up until recently, there were no signs of that changing. The well-trodden path, those existing networks between the economic and political elite remained intact, open, and accessible. Given the country's current predicaments, that might change. Sue, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, for that cogent presentation of capital's role, which is so often missing from our understanding, as you say, of the dynamics that Tula referred to of transition. I have a number of questions to put to each of you, if I may, abuse the privileges of the chair. If I could begin, Stuart, we're putting a question about the Commonwealth to you. You outlined the various teams that the Commonwealth said you outlined 4 particularly of these. Did the Secretariat maintain a team in South Africa throughout that time to provide the necessary administrative support, the on-ground information? What were the sources for the Commonwealth? Were you drawing on High Commission reports in terms of shaping and framing those teams going in? And who paid for them? How big were the teams? You implied that they were relatively small, even if they were led by people of stature. Could you elaborate, please, on, if you like, the structures of diplomacy that the Commonwealth used and its sources of information?
Thank you, Sue. Yes, each team was supported by its own administration in South Africa. So there were offices in the various points of deployment, an office in Johannesburg, for the East Rand, and an office in Durban, I think, for Natal, KwaZulu-Natal. So that was, in that respect, on the ground support. In addition, of course, there was support from the Secretariat in London. The funding was provided by all Commonwealth governments and by a degree of extra budgetary support, as far as I recall. And the teams, as you say, were not huge. I think in terms of the United Nations mission, UNOMSA, they got to a size, eventual size of 50 observers. The initial Secretariat, the initial Commonwealth deployment was 18. There were around the same number of European Community observers, and I think there were 4 from the OAU. And the numbers, I think, were around that sort of mark as far as the European Union, the Commonwealth, and the OAU were concerned. This does obviously beg the question about how effective these forces could be, these missions could be, given the vastness of South Africa and the degree of violence that was in train. I think I would say that where they were able to make a difference is because they were concentrating their efforts very much in very specific areas where the violence was at its worst in terms of the Commonwealth team anyway. The UN took a decision to be representative across South Africa, and the European Community also took a similar approach, so their teams in that respect were dispersed. But I think it is instructive that the team in Natal, I calculated that there was something like 1 million people affected by the local peace agreements that they were able to negotiate in those unrest areas within KwaZulu-Natal. So although it does seem a massive task, I think that nonetheless a difference was made.
Thank you very much indeed, Stuart. And I know from my own interviews with Moses Anafu, the extent to which he used his initiative and also the authority of the Commonwealth in a series of extraordinarily brave initiatives in KwaZulu-Natal to very great effect. And the influence that had, in fact, on Nelson Mandela's view of the Commonwealth. so that there was both the agency of organization, but also the agency of the individual there. Tula, I have a question for you. You very kindly picked up on the purpose of this seminar, which is to highlight this question of legacies and the tailwinds. You talked about the structural changes in the South African economy, the legacies of the unraveling of the homeland's economies, and attempts to minimize, of course, failed miserably, accelerated rural-urban migration. But I'd like to pick up also on what Peter said about capital's political agenda of identifying key ANC functionaries. Because what of ideology? I mean, after all, the powerful narrative that still exists of the National Democratic Revolution is still political currency in South Africa today. Do you think that this is also a function of the way that South Africa had a fudged, complex, complicated, multifaceted transition that then, as the international political economy and the domestic economy was changing, perhaps too, the ideologically prescripts also needed to change from the ANC as the dominant liberation party?
Yeah, I've got no decisive comments to offer, but my observation and feeling listening to Peter du Toit's presentation is the ANC was determined to ensure that during the negotiations, we have a two-sided negotiations table. Either you're a member of the regime or you're part of the forces of liberation. And it's striking the extent to which business felt that those were their only two options from the presentation, that we have to try, if we're going to be effective, to speak with the incoming government, and that can only be the ANC. An alternative or strategy would have been, say, a nation-building project to make sure that you're investing in these various forms of civil society who could form small platoons for a small L liberal free market society. And from my reading of his presentation, I'm not an expert, I'm just a listener to what he's saying, the extent to which that didn't even seem to be part of the strategy. It literally was, we have a two-sided negotiations table, we have an outgoing regime and an incoming administration, and we've got to make our choices. And I wonder what they would think, looking at the situation from 2022, thinking that their only option was to try and convert radical socialists and union leaders into free market capitalists, and those are the only strategies we have.
Peter, what are your thoughts on that? Would you say that it was such a bifurcated either-or strategy, or in fact it was more complex?
As with all things, Sue, it was very complex, of course, but I do think that it became clear to capital, and we're talking in capital was not hegemonic at that stage. You had different sides. You had old English capital in the form of Anglo-American. You had Afrikaner capital in the form of Rembrandt. They often did not see eye to eye, but I think the one thing that they all agreed on was that change was coming, and that they had to identify who the leaders of the liberation movement was. Obviously, the African National Congress in exile took on an almost mythical status during those years. And it was quite striking that during the mid-1980s, one of the first contacts between any South Africans and the ANC in exile was between Anglo-American and ANC, and not national intelligence and the ANC, for example. So that's significant. And I think they very early on thought and saw that if we want to keep on operating in the country, we're going to have to make friends with who we think might come in after 1990 or whenever political change was coming. I think there were two distinct periods, 1985 to 1990, before the release of Mandela, before the unbanning of liberation movements. They were in the dark about who the liberation movement leaders were internally, not so much externally, but definitely internally. And post 1990, it became clear to certainly individuals in the Anglo-American fold that the African National Congress, like Tula said, was the only game in town. It frustrated people like Jay Naidoo and the trade union movement enormously, who were part of the internal resistance movement, who actually put in a lot of effort to try and consider alternative economic policies for the country post-liberation, whenever that might be. You'd recall that COSATU, the Trade Union Federation, had an economic research department who between 1985 and 1990 produced a number of research reports and alternative policy proposals for a post-apartheid South African economic dispensation. Now, that was cast to the side by the ANC, who refused to engage with either the SACP or COSATU on that. And I think Big Capital took their lead from that, seeing that after post-1990, after Mandela's release, they hedged their bets and thought and argued and believed that Mandela was going to become the president. The people around Mandela, and Thabo Mbeki was an absolutely key role player in this. Everyone I interviewed for my book identified Mbeki as absolutely central, not only to the political transition, but most definitely to try and carve out a post-apartheid economic dispensation. So they put in all their effort into the ANC, Thabo Mbeki and the individuals around him.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Emily, my question to you concerns the engagement of the communities that and the women that you've interviewed, the lasting trauma and the extent to which their lack of social trust in institutions of the state. And the state, the present state, it cannot provide security for them, for their families, and it can't provide either retributive justice or restorative justice, it seems at the moment. And as Tula has pointed to as well, it's that the lack of the state, the violence of the state perpetrated on victims, so rather than having a benevolent function. So do you see this as also part of the key legacies of the apartheid era, the lack of social trust in institutions of the state, which continue to affect communities' engagement with the political process, with the social process, with community building, and it would impede governance at local level, ward level, municipal level. So in other words, that there are very insidious, dangerous, corrosive processes that are also embedded in this practice of violence.
Yes, definitely. And the women we've been interviewing for this project have, often they draw no difference between the past state and the present state. And in their narratives would often kind of temporally jump back and forth between talking about the past and the present when critiquing the state, and the critiques they make of the two are very similar. And there's a huge sense of post-apartheid disappointment in the state. In terms of everything you mentioned, not just in terms of kind of socioeconomic support, but also in terms of heritage and memorialization of the 1990s conflict. There's, this huge sense of being forgotten, and there not having been enough done to locally commemorate those who died from 1990 to 1994 and remember them. So it's, this quest for reparations isn't just financial. Of course, a large aspect of it is financial, but it's also just about feeling forgotten. The women we spoke to are incredibly critical of the current state, and lots of them drew links. They talked about Ramaphosa coming to Thokoza in the 1990s and needing to be kind of protected by the community. And then drawing links to the present, saying, and now he acts like he's never been here. He's forgotten us. Does he not remember? We saved his life back in the day. And that story has become another one of these kind of collective memories and almost collective myths told in this critique of the state.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm now going to move to the Q&A. There's one question typed in the questions box. Please, can I encourage members in the audience, I'm afraid I can't see you, to put your questions here and to say which of the panelists you would like your question to be directed. A question from fellow senior research fellow Martin Plaut for Stuart, describing the robust Commonwealth response to the Boipatong massacre, which left 40 people dead. And Martin draws the comparison of the Commonwealth's silence, in effect, the lack of Commonwealth's response to the Zuma inspired riots of 2021, when according to official figures, 354 people died. Can you say that the Commonwealth at that point was prepared to speak out more vociferously, and what explains its relative current silence in your view?
Well, first of all, the Zuma riots and the death toll involved were undoubtedly shocking. Not, I don't think, isolated or unique in terms of South Africa's recent history. And indeed, incidents like this seem to have run through the century, actually. I think the circumstances, however, of the transition era and the position of the Commonwealth at that point are markedly different in the case of the two areas of loss of life that Martin cites. As far as I understand it, the riots and the death toll was caused by a multiplicity of different factors. And of course, it was during the COVID-19 pandemic, which would have made life more difficult and may well have been part of the cause. I know that a number of governments expressed their concern and offered assistance, but I'm not aware that any organization or national government suggested intervention at that point, as far as the South African government is concerned. I don't know what Commonwealth did. I'm not party to the current Secretary General of their initiatives, so I don't know whether privately she expressed her concern to a fellow Commonwealth member. But I do think the two, although superficially they look very much the same issue, I'm not sure that they are, because of the different circumstances of the two incidents.
Thank you very much indeed. No more questions in the Q&A at the moment. If I may put a question, please, to Tula. Given the current level of ANC infighting, which has been characterized by some sections in the South African press as akin to a civil war with inside the National Liberation Party, how far do you think this current fractured state within the ANC can be traced back to the period of transition? Or would you say that, in fact, there are different inputs and different drivers to the current level of use of violence, but also political antagonism that exists within the ruling party?
Well, it's factionalism with a following peculiar characteristic that nobody gets sacked and nobody ever resigns. To the extent that it can be traced to the transitional period, it is the transition from being a hunted, persecuted liberation movement fighting for its life to one which controls the resources of the most powerful and wealthiest state in the African continent, and the divisions which that gives. I mean, there was a time in the 1990s where people would posit that it is something which is in this shape, that is vertical between the left and the ANC, but it's actually those who are on the inside, and it cuts across these organizations, and that's the factionalism that is developed, and it's related to proximity to state resources and the possibilities for accessing those funds.
So you see this as neo-patrimonial behavior, as you say, it's a question of access to financial resources of the state, defined. And
that's partly why nobody ever quite definitively takes a hike on matters of supposed principle.
Peter, I see you're nodding about that. What would be your take?
Look, I agree with Tula. I mean, what we are seeing now is the absolute fight to death in this country by various neo-patrimonial and patronage networks to retain access to networks of resource extraction. At the end of the day, it's about maintaining a hold on government budgets at all levels of the state, whether it's national, provincial, or municipal. We do see the proliferation of these networks, who are now also linking up with organized crime syndicates. You know, I head our investigations team at News 24, and that's simply all we deal with every single day, is identifying and exposing networks of extraction linked to politicians and linked to government departments, whether it is at municipal or national or provincial level. The problem that Cyril Ramaphosa has is that if he was to close down these networks, if he was going to close the taps or step his foot on the deluge of resources that's being piped out of the state, he's going to have to kill off his own party. He's going to have to kill off his own comrades in the political sense, and that will mean his own political end and the end of the ANC, which, well, you know, which from the vantage point where we are sitting in the South African media, it's simply a matter of time before the African National Congress goes the way of the National Party, whether it's in 2024, 2029. I think the rot in the organization is much too deep, and there's a complete and utter lack of political will to turn things around in the party itself. The crisis is now spilled beyond the party and into the state. And as I'm speaking to you now, the head of our power utility is saying that they're doing everything that they can to prevent a total grid collapse. So, you know, all of that can be traced to 1994.
Thank you very much indeed. Emily, I have one question around I suppose, the political agenda of the Khulumani group. To what extent are they seeking to join forces with the wider South African women's movements? I mean, you identified the group who had suffered atrociously during the period of transition, but is there the wider voice of women, given the level of violence against women in South Africa, surely part of a political discourse of addressing these appalling levels of abuse, of addressing the need for reparation, for addressing the intergenerational trauma that continues to be visited on South African women and girls?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. That's a great question. I mean, Khulumani as an organization has put increasing spotlight over recent years on gender-based and sexual violence as a kind of focus of the organization and some of its working. But that has been particularly around sexual violence perpetrated by state security forces, predominantly during the transition era and also the 1980s. And I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of the organization, but from what I understand, it's more about highlighting sexual violence and the failures of the TRC to address it as part of this wider push for reparations, and pushing for victims of sexual violence to be seen as victims of apartheid era human rights abuses, more so than it is about partnering with or becoming part of this wider women's movement in South Africa to critique and to work against contemporary gender-based and sexual violence.
Thank you very much, Emily. A question from Rory Jubba that the panelists haven't referred in talking about South Africa's transition in 1990 to 1994, the question of the geopolitical changes that were going on at the time, the collapse, obviously, of the Berlin Wall in 1989, but then the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. Can any of the topics that have been discussed today be placed in that context? In other words, the historical contingency of the fluidity of the international system. Are there then should we say, implications, significance for South Africa today, given the lasting legacies in their various forms and norms and the shifting geopolitical context? So was the international climate more permissive between 1990 and 1994? Does the international climate today, presage anything particular for South Africa's challenges and structural forces and challenges going forward, would you say, in your view? Stuart, if I begin with you, please.
Well, I think it's certainly true that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the consequences in terms of the collapse of the Soviet Union did have an impact on how apartheid was viewed and how it felt, the regime felt it could hang on. One of the great bogies that it had been deployed was the communist threat, as it were. And this was something which the fall of the Berlin Wall effectively destroyed. So I think it did lead to a much greater openness and a feeling that there were no further allies for the regime in Africa, no further excuses, if you like, to avoid the inevitability of negotiation. Now, in terms of how that plays to the present, I'm not so sure that I can give you an answer, but certainly I think it did contribute to a considerable openness about those negotiations.
Okay, thank you. Tula, your view, please.
Yeah, it is decisive in deciding FW de Klerk to go for Big Bang reform, complete unconditional unbanning of the liberation movements and unconditional release of the political prisoners. The calculation is that it will sufficiently have defanged and left ANC toothless, that they will be amenable to a bold process like that, and that it creates a new situation. The problem is that it involves disabling all of the mechanisms that the state has built up to try and contain the ANC, and that you're hoping that your reading is correct and his calculation was incorrect because the ANC was able to consolidate in the early 1990s. So it was a failed strategy as far as de Klerk was concerned.
Well, there's also, though, Tula, the way in which de Klerk sought to use the changing international climate as a way to defang his conservative critics. So it wasn't simply aimed at the ANC and going, as you say, for the Big Bang strategy, because he was facing those who would quite willingly stab him in the back, quite as well as political opponents across the spectrum.
I'd be interested in what others think, but I think there's an understanding that the Conservative Party is not, you know, it's a lost cause as far as National Party support is concerned. And his idea is that there is enough of a coalition for reform within the National Party and across the country as a whole to be able to see the process through. And he felt that he would be able to handle it better than he could. I mean, there's people like Herman Gillemy, a great historian. He speaks about many of the colleagues within the South African state apparatus saying, why did he not lean on us to any extent as a resource which could be used to contain the ANC? He calculated, I think, that the fallout from the collapse of the Berlin Wall would create a new situation where the ANC would be sufficiently off balance for him to be able to force a negotiated settlement through. And the ANC was not as destabilized as he hoped that would be the case.
Thank you, Tula. Pete, sorry, Emily, you were waving. Were you waving? Okay, right. Peter, my question is can we actually identify a paradoxical role here that the collapse of, Soviet-led socialism and the Soviet Union, to what extent do you think it emboldened capital in South Africa? Because, we're the only game in town, but also you still have that narrative of the history of USSR solidarity support, which continues to feed into South Africa's a South African political mindset today in terms of its
absolutely, Sue. Just one thing, just to Tula's point and your point about the Conservatives. I think there was a by-election in Potchefstroom in 1989 after the National Party lost support there, and then de Klerk actually took a chance to call out the election, which he then won, which then defanged the Conservatives almost completely, I would argue. And then obviously the 1992 referendum. Look, the Anglo-American, when they returned from Lusaka in September 1985, were absolutely gobsmacked by the extent to which the ANC in 1985 September, that was after Gorbachev took over in the Soviet Union, remained under the influence of Leninism, Marxism, and how they continue to espouse the ideas of the Freedom Charter, which Anglo and Capital, upon their return, remained deeply concerned about. They tried to engage Oliver Tambo from 1985 onwards at a couple of engagements abroad outside of South Africa about the future shape of a South African economy, and it was very, very clear to them that the communists and or the socialists in the ANC's NEC, according to Stephen Ellis's wonderful research about the ANC in exile, the SACP held sway in the ANC's NEC during that period. So they were deeply concerned about the ANC that remained under the influence of the Soviet Union, of East Germany, and some of the more socialist-minded countries in Scandinavia, and that was a great source of concern. And they did decide to do everything that they could to try and bring the ANC to different insights. Of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the complete discrediting of the communist system by the end of the 1980s and early 1990s made it much easier for them. But the ANC up until this day, and I'd like to hear what Tula thinks about this, but the ANC up until this day, remains very much in thrall about a democratic centralist system where the state, where the economic development is state-led, even though evidence might point to the contrary. They do believe that the government and the ANC government is the vanguard of economic development, and they've stuck to that since the 1990s. That has not changed. It might have there might have been some degree of change between 1996 when GEAR as a macroeconomic policy was adopted, and I'd say 2007-8 when Jacob Zuma's faction replaced Thabo Mbeki. But the ANC largely still remains in thrall and in belief of a centralized system. And those roots lie in the mid-1980s. And I suppose it lies in the fact that you had an organization supported for many decades by the Soviet Union and others. And that loyalty, we've spoken about South Africa conducting naval exercises with Russia as we speak off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal, remains intact. So the end of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, it did change things, but I would argue that it has not completely won over the ANC into a free market system.
Thank you, Peter. Tula, your response to Peter's remarks.
Very briefly, there's a tragic component to this, and it goes back to 1913 and the Land Act. So even before the Russian Revolution, the founders of the ANC had this idea that economic upliftment would be by property ownership, Christianity, and the whole liberal tendency. Then comes the Land Act long before 1917 in Moscow, and there's a shift in the discourse. And there's all sorts of terminology introduced into the ANC's public proclamations, such as the state being organized around mobilizing slave labor. And this is something which creates a receptive environment for the communists. And where the almost tragic element of this is that if the state is a benign force willing to negotiate with African interlocutors like the ANC founders in 1912 felt, that is one attitude to the state. If that's not the case, then you can't look for any friendship or solidarity or partnership with the state. It becomes about seizing state power. And that is something that the ANC gradually comes to the recognition of. And the stakes of the liberation movement always were that the struggle has to end with the accumulation of state power and the use of state power to redress all that is wrong. Now, we can speak about the salience of communist ideology as being the reason why the ANC simply will not let Eskom go. But there's a much deeper, much more rooted reason. If you say that the state can no longer be used as the mechanism to address poverty, you are saying, and ANC will say this, the reason why they don't want to let it go, what will happen to the poor if the electricity power generation is privatized? you're admitting that the whole master strategy of the whole liberation struggle was a mistake, essentially, that when you come to power, these organs will be repurposed to benefit the poor. There have been huge inefficiencies. There's been massive amounts of corruption, but there's that fundamental connection between what is happening now and a century ago. It predates communism. Communism provides a language. It provides an alliance which can provide weaponry, but there's that whole master strategy. And they will have to let it go. There's no alternative because it's unsustainable, the trajectory we're on at the moment, but that's the reason why it's so difficult for them to let it go.
As you say, because they have so vested in the construct of the state as the benevolent addresser of, as you say, historic ills, historic wrongs. But then, as you have identified, you have the South Africa as an extraordinary hybrid state, as a mature, economically diverse economy, but also a developmental state, and the extent to which that those two structures of the state were also embedded in the apartheid system. So, as you say, it's the ultimate confluence of the contradictions coming forward. Colleagues, we have a mere 6 minutes left. Are there questions you'd like to put to each other about your remarks? I have a question about the role of ideas, after all, in supporting states. The international investment that you have described, Stuart, in supporting racial rights in South Africa. To what extent do you think that the Commonwealth continued to be invested in ensuring socioeconomic rights and the genuine fulfillment of racial rights in South Africa following 1990 and 1994? Tula, the extent to which that the ANC continued to dominate throughout the 1990s rather than alternative forms and norms of political expression. How do you account for this? I know your scholarship has also looked at the PAC. Emily, your work, of course, has looked at women's movements, but it seems that there is a relative withering away of other aspects of state or the societal mobilization. Is that fair in the 1990s, or is that a misrepresentation? Peter, the extent to which that you talk about old elites shifting into new elites, what do you think this presages for going forward? If indeed the next election will see an era of coalition politics, you've implied that those who are determined to keep their grip on state resources will be very, very resistant, and they will fight dirty, to put it in a colloquial way, to hang on. What does this then say for processes of transition going forward? If indeed South Africa is moving to a post-dominant Liberation Party era. So my question, Stuart, to you, the extent to which the Commonwealth remained invested.
Well, I think that one of the, to me anyway, really interesting features of the transition period was the alacrity with which the new South African government in 1994 reapplied to join the Commonwealth. It was within a month of the elections that the application formally came and was approved almost immediately. And now I know Commonwealth wasn't alone in terms of South Africa's re-engagement with the world, and that was a crucial driver. But it was, I think, interesting that the ANC, and it was the ANC principally that obviously decided that, felt that the Commonwealth as a network would be helpful in terms of reconnecting with the world. The approach to the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth's approach to South Africa has for many years been held by the whole experience of those many decades of involvement, and also by Nelson Mandela's period as president as a kind of Commonwealth senior statesman. And because of the circumstances of events that followed in the next few years, he himself became
5 minutes.
A major figure in terms of establishing the kind of Commonwealth's human rights regime as far as its mechanisms for upholding its values was concerned. The formation of the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group to to follow up any backsliders in the Commonwealth. That was something that followed his reactions to Abacha's regime in Nigeria, which of course I know was not shared widely. So, you know, in that immediate period, there was a great deal of fellow feeling. I think after Zimbabwe and Thabo Mbeki, there was a considerable change.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart. Colleagues, we have another 5 minutes. I realize that you may have to go. I do hope that you don't have to gallop away on the hour. Question to Tula. Other political forces, I, of course, didn't mention Inkatha, but the extent to which then the way of transition just saw a continued ANC dominance to, would you say, the exclusion of other political forces in the 1990s?
Inkatha manages to consolidate itself in KZN, of course. The ANC has the headwind of economic success in the late 90s and early 2000s, driven partly by commodities boom, but also very sensible stewarding of the country's public finances as well. And if you look at the surveys of where South Africa falls on global optimism scales, it's very high. And there's a rewarding of the ANC for its perceived performance as far as that is concerned. There's also a huge amount of trauma as results of the violence of the early 1990s and the idea that the ANC is capable of bringing stability. We also need to speak about the aspects of the 1980s political culture reflected by no-go areas, necklace killings, and the political intolerance there. That's part of the legacy that we have, and which makes it difficult for other parties to organize. So you literally have people trying to organize and campaign politically, but being refused and being unable to do so. Those are all parts of the aspect, but and it's the disintegration of all of them which I think lead to the erosion of ANC dominance now.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter, your thoughts about whether transition 1990 to 1994 suggests anything for this transition?
Sue, I think the one lesson that we can take away is that, and that's the purpose of today's seminar, was to show how many forces came together during that period to force change. It wasn't only one event or one individual or one organization that helped make the transition possible. And the role that capital played, like you said, is something that historically has not been considered as it should. You know, so capital did play a very active role during that period. It played an active role in facilitating and helping to facilitate the negotiations by providing logistical support. It involved itself in the transition period in trying to lobby the incoming political elite to take a certain economic policy position going forward, and it used its sway with the rest of the elites in the country to try and ensure buy-in for the transition. Obviously, you know, we can't delve into all the details here, but capital was not hegemonic, but by and large, the biggest role players, that's the role that they played. I think what we need to see in the current state that we're in is big capital and economic and business leaders again stepping up and coming to the fore in trying to influence and trying to help the country out of its current predicament, which is a predicament of low economic growth, poor political leadership, entrenched and worsening corruption, and the attendant problems with that, high unemployment, increased inequality, and increased poverty. So big capital and economic and business leaders again need to step up engagement with government, and it needs to be vocal about the way in which it's doing so. The difference between the period between 1990 and 94 and where we are now is that in the early 1990s, business engaged, when it engaged with the National Party government and the ANC, it on the one side engaged with an illegitimate government in the form of a minority apartheid leadership, and it engaged with the liberation movement, which represented, as they saw it, the biggest and the most significant aspirations of most South Africans. Now you have a legitimate government that is governing as part of a popular mandate given to it by a series of elections which has not yet been brought into question, and we still have a functioning and an efficient electoral system. So it's going to have to happen. The context is much different, but I would argue that big capital and big business again needs to step it up and again needs to involve itself in the political process, much more so than it has done over the last 20 years, probably much more so than capital has to do in a functioning democracy. But given the state of our country, of our economy at the moment, I think it's warranted.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Emily, my last question to you about what are your views as an active researcher about the importance of the women's movement and women's experience in transitions that we've been talking about?
Yeah, well, first speaking about civil society in general, and what happens after the transition period is, of course, you get this kind of vacuum in civil society organizations as the kind of best and brightest move from being anti-state to moving into the state themselves. And particularly within the women's movement, that does leave this kind of empty space across much of the late 90s and early 2000s. And today, gender-based violence organizations kind of have to decide whether to align themselves to the state and hopefully gain resources from them, or to be kind of anti-state and part of that civil society protest-based movement. And if there is kind of another transition coming in South Africa, as Peter predicted, that may well happen again. But in terms of the women's movement and the future for South Africa, I think it's just not, with what's going on in the economy at the moment, women's issues, as always, are taking a second seat. It's just not as pressing of an issue to address as for the government as keeping the lights on. And the more that the economy kind of continues to falter, to fail, I think the less and less attention we'll see being paid to women's issues and to gender-based violence.
Colleagues, thank you very much indeed. My sincere thanks to Emily, to Tula, to Peter, and to Stuart for your expert comments, for your wide-ranging remarks and engagement with questions. And thank you for responding to my questions, which may have seemed artless, but they were trying to get you to expound upon your extensive knowledge. And I'm enormously grateful for you doing that. As I say, this forms the first of our two events on South Africa. The second will be on the 23rd of March, in which Martin Plaut, Senior Research Fellow, will be in conversation with Professor Adam Habib, who of course is Director now of the School of Oriental and African Studies, and also Justice Malala, the political commentator. So we're delighted to have had this excellent start to our two-part series, and thank you very much indeed.